In the distant corners of the galaxy, a war was being waged on a planet that had long been forgotten by peace. The planet was a barren landscape, scorched by endless conflict, its skies perpetually overcast with the smoke of distant explosions. General Threx of the Tevra coalition stood on the observation deck of his flagship, eyes fixed on the battlefield below. His species, the Tevro, were masters of war, strategic, intelligent, and deadly. Over the centuries, they had faced countless enemies, each unique and challenging in their own way. But none had been quite as puzzling as the humans. The Tevra had encountered humanity only recently, after a series of diplomatic breakthroughs. The humans, with their primitive technology and unremarkable position in the galactic pecking order, had been thrust into the intergalactic war effort. Threx was not impressed. His coalition was filled with ancient and powerful species: the Clorg, hulking behemoths with impenetrable skin; the Zyphran, whose psionic powers could obliterate entire platoons; and the Vexar, deadly assassins skilled in the art of stealth. All of them had faced their share of battles. But humanity? They were little more than an afterthought. Zoa Morrow, the human commander leading the battalion, had been a soldier before she rose through the ranks to command. Her reputation was a mixed one: brash, unpredictable, and fierce. She didn't fit the usual mold of galactic leadership, and her methods were unconventional, to say the least. In a military culture where precision, advanced technology, and overwhelming firepower were prized above all, Zoa's approach was a gamble, driven by instinct and an almost reckless sense of determination. Threx watched from the high vantage point as the battle began. His Tevra forces were moving in with their typical brutal efficiency, charging forward with heavy artillery, energy shields, and battlesuits that seemed invulnerable to anything less than a direct hit. The human battalion, by contrast, looked small and poorly equipped. Their weapons were primitive, their armor outdated by galactic standards, and they seemed to rely on traditional strategies. Yet, there was something about the way they moved something that couldn't be ignored. As the Tevra forces began their assault, Zoa's soldiers did not retreat, as expected. Instead, they adjusted, adapting to the Tevra's powerful charge with fluid movements that seemed almost instinctive. A group of humans moved forward under fire, dodging blasts with unnatural agility. Another squad, hiding in the wreckage of a destroyed building, launched a surprise attack from above, catching a Tevra platoon off guard. They weren't using the most advanced weaponry, but their tactics were clever, unpredictable, and effective. Zoa watched as her troops executed maneuvers that made no sense from a military standpoint, yet they were working. A group of soldiers lured a Tevra heavy tank into a narrow ravine where its massive frame couldn't move, leaving it vulnerable to a concentrated blast from a nearby cannon. Another unit used a decoy to bait a group of elite Tevra soldiers into a trap, encircling them in a heartbeat. These were strategies Threx had never encountered before, and they were working. The human soldiers weren't just fighting, they were fighting with a kind of ferocity that he had never seen in other species. They weren't bound by the same limitations of their weapons or their environment. They adapted. They changed. They didn't rely on the strength of their armor or firepower, but on their ingenuity and their willingness to throw the rules of warfare out the window. For the first time, Threx began to question everything he had assumed about humanity. The battle raged on, and it wasn't long before the Tevra forces began to feel the strain. Though they were stronger, faster, and more technologically advanced, they were being outmaneuvered. The humans' unpredictability kept them off balance, and their sheer resilience in the face of impossible odds was something that the Tevra were unprepared for. Threx stood frozen, observing with growing disbelief. For years, he had prided himself on understanding the nature of every species in the galaxy. He had studied their tactics, learned their weaknesses, and outwitted them in battle. But this was something different. The humans, these primitive beings, were not playing by the same rules. In fact, they didn't even seem to care about the rules. It was as though their strength didn't lie in their weapons, but in something far deeper. Something that Threx could not quantify. Zoa Morrow, with her unorthodox methods and fierce determination, was leading her soldiers not just to survive, but to win. In the midst of the chaos, she stood tall, calm in the face of violence. There was something about the way she moved, the way she spoke to her troops. It was as if she had tapped into a deeper well of strength that the Tevra couldn't understand. Threx had seen many soldiers in his time, those who fought because they had to, those who fought because they were strong, and those who fought because they had no other choice. But Zoa Moro and her humans, they fought because they could. They fought not for victory, but because they believed they could make a difference. And that belief, Threx realized with growing horror, was the most dangerous weapon of all. As the battle drew to a close, the Tevra forces were forced into retreat, their strategy in tatters. The humans had proven themselves far more capable than anyone had expected. And for the first time in his career, General Threx wondered, what had he truly underestimated? The power of human soldiers was not in their technology, nor in their numbers. It was in their unpredictable, relentless drive to win. And that, he feared, was something no one had prepared for. As he looked over the battlefield, Threx couldn't shake the thought that this battle, this encounter, was only the beginning. The humans had shown him something extraordinary, and now he would have to decide what to do with that knowledge. The war raged on, and General Threx found himself increasingly obsessed with understanding the unexplainable advantage that humanity seemed to possess. Each encounter with Zoa's battalion made him rethink everything he had ever believed about warfare. Her soldiers weren't the strongest, the smartest, or the most technologically advanced, but there was something about them that was deeply unsettling. They moved as a cohesive unit, almost as if they could read each other's minds, responding to threats with an instinctive grace that defied all logic. Threx's attention shifted entirely to Zoa Moro. There was a quiet intensity about her, something that made her seem out of place in the galaxy of cold logic and meticulous strategy. The humans under her command fought with a kind of desperate energy, but also a palpable loyalty to her. It was almost as if they believed in her with an unshakable trust, something that wasn't common in the galaxy. His own soldiers, though loyal, fought because they had been conditioned to do so. Zoa's soldiers fought because they believed in something more. And that belief, Threx could see, made them far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Zoa, however, was not as confident as she appeared. She stood at the helm of this human battalion, a leader and a symbol for her people. But deep inside, she was struggling. Every victory she achieved came at a cost, one that gnawed at her conscience. She could hear the cries of her fallen soldiers in her dreams, their faces haunting her during quiet moments. It wasn't just the physical toll of war that weighed on her. It was the psychological burden of knowing that each battle was one step closer to humanity's place in the galaxy. And with each step, she had to send more and more of her soldiers to their deaths. The mission, once simple in her mind, prove humanity's worth, had turned into something far more complex. She had become both a symbol and a pawn, pushing forward not only for survival but for a future that was no longer clear. She had pledged to lead humanity into the galactic community, but at what cost? Every victory made her question the morality of her cause. She knew that humanity had to be recognized, but she wasn't sure anymore if it was worth the price of so many lives. That it wasn't just the physical costs of war that began to weigh on her. It was the growing tension within her own ranks. The unity she had cultivated among her soldiers began to fray at the edges. The same soldiers who had once followed her without question were now starting to hesitate, to question the leadership they had once trusted. Whispers of discontent spread like wildfire. Some began to doubt the morality of their mission. Others questioned their place in this war that seemed so endless and brutal. But the greatest challenge came from an unexpected source. As the war continued, the Tevra, frustrated by their inability to defeat humanity's unpredictable tactics, turned the battlefield into a psychological war. They began to target Zoa directly, attacking her command structure from within. The Tevra infiltrated her ranks with spies, turning soldiers against each other and creating an atmosphere of suspicion. It was no longer enough to defend against external forces. Zoa found herself caught in a web of lies, distrust, and betrayal. Her soldiers now had to face an enemy they couldn't see, one that was hiding inside their own ranks. The first sign of this covert attack came when one of Zoa's most trusted officers, Lieutenant Callum, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. He had been a friend to Zoa, someone she had relied on during the early days of the war. The circumstances of his death suggested sabotage. His weapon had been tampered with, and there were signs that someone had manipulated his plans to lead him into an ambush. As she looked into the matter further, it became clear that someone was working against her, not from the outside, but from within. Tensions began to rise as whispers spread through the battalion. Soldiers began accusing each other of being spies. Loyalty was questioned, friendships were tested, and the unity that had once been Zoa's greatest strength began to fracture. How could she trust her own people when they might be betraying her, selling their loyalty to the enemy in exchange for promises of power and status? The human side of the war was no longer just about defeating the Tevra. It was about holding on to the very soul of humanity. In the midst of this growing turmoil, Zoa uncovered a shocking truth. There were factions within the human ranks, high-ranking officials who had secretly allied with the Tevra. These traitors had been feeding information to the enemy in exchange for promises of political favor and power. This betrayal cut deeper than anything Zoa had ever expected. The very people she had once trusted, those who swore to protect humanity, were selling them out for personal gain. This revelation shook Zoa to her core. She had spent so long trying to prove humanity's worth, to show that they belonged among the stars, that she had never imagined that their own people could be their worst enemies. These officials weren't just betraying their comrades on the battlefield, they were putting the entire future of humanity at risk. The war had become more than a fight for survival. It was now a fight for the very principles humanity stood for. Zoa found herself torn. She had always believed in the strength of humanity, in their ability to rise above the challenges they faced. But now, as she looked at the fractured unity within her own ranks, she began to question whether humanity was ready for the responsibilities of the galaxy. Could they truly stand as equals among the stars, or had they already begun to lose the qualities that made them unique? The moral dilemma before her was more complex than any battlefield strategy. The war had taken a darker turn, and Zoa's role had become something far more complicated. It was no longer just about winning the war. It was about preserving the very essence of humanity, about ensuring that they didn't lose themselves in the process. As the enemy closed in from all sides, Zoa realized that her greatest battle might not be against the Tevra, but against the internal conflict that was tearing her own people apart. And if she couldn't find a way to unite them again, everything she had fought for would be lost. Zoa had always been resolute, her will unshakable, even in the darkest of times. Yet, as the months dragged on, the weight of her decisions and the continuous losses began to fray her once unyielding determination. Every victory felt hollow. Every success was tainted by the human cost it took to achieve it. She had entered this war with a singular goal: to prove humanity's worth. But now, as the conflict dragged into its brutal, unrelenting depths, Zoa began to question whether that goal was worth the price she and her soldiers were paying. The endless battles were taking their toll on her body and soul. Zoa was no stranger to loss, but the betrayal and the constant uncertainty gnawed at her. The galaxy had seen humanity as a tool, an expendable asset in a larger political game. Zoa had become a symbol, but also a pawn, manipulated by forces far beyond her control. Her soldiers, once filled with idealism, now fought with heavy hearts, their trust in her and their cause beginning to wane. In the midst of her despair, a devastating ambush by the Tevra would alter the course of the war and Zoa's life. It wasn't just another battle. It was a crushing blow that would leave her battalion decimated. The ambush had been carefully orchestrated, a calculated strike designed to cripple their ability to fight back. Zoa's forces fought valiantly, but without their usual cohesion, they were overwhelmed. The soldiers who survived the onslaught were battered and broken, their morale shattered. But in the aftermath of the attack, a startling revelation emerged, one that turned everything Zoa thought she knew about the war upside down. It wasn't just humanity that the Tevra were after. The Tevra, who had once been solely focused on domination, were now intent on something far more insidious. They sought to uncover the true nature of humanity. The Tevra had spent centuries studying countless species, collecting data on their strengths, weaknesses, and technologies. And yet, in humanity, they had found something they hadn't accounted for: a species that thrived on chaos, unpredictability, and emotion. Unlike the others they had encountered, Humanity could not be understood or manipulated by pure logic or technology. The Tevra had always believed that the key to domination lay in perfecting control through technology, power, and precision. But in humanity, they saw something they had never encountered before, a species that could not be predicted, a species whose very unpredictability could alter the course of an entire galaxy. Zoa realized that the Tevra's true objective was no longer simply to conquer humanity. No, they wanted to control it. They wanted to harness the very chaos that made humans unpredictable and unpredictable in ways they could not replicate. They wanted to bottle the emotional force, the drive, and the raw, unrefined power that had always been inherent to humanity for their own use. Zoa stood at the center of it all, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She had thought she was fighting for humanity's survival, fighting to protect what made them unique, but in reality, she had been manipulated into a war that wasn't hers to fight. She had become a tool in a much larger game, one in which her people were not just pawns, but a resource to be harvested. The Tevra were not the only ones using humanity for their own purposes. Her own people, the human political factions, had been feeding information to the Tevra, playing their own hand in the galactic game. The war, Zoa now realized, was never about freedom or survival. It was about control, about manipulating humanity's unpredictable nature to serve the needs of those in power. The realization struck Zoa like a physical blow. She had believed in her mission, in the cause, but now it seemed that her every step had been steered by forces beyond her understanding. Humanity's leaders had played the same game as the Tevra, using their soldiers as bargaining chips in a galactic political struggle. The cost of victory, of achieving a place for humanity among the stars, was no longer just measured in lives lost. It was measured in the very soul of humanity. The betrayal left Zoa reeling. How could she continue fighting in a war that threatened to strip away everything she had fought for? How could she lead her soldiers to a future that might be worse than the one they were already facing? Humanity, for all its strengths, was being twisted into something it was never meant to be. The very things that made humans unique emotion, chaos, imperfection, were now being used against them. Zoa could no longer abide by this. She could not, in good conscience, continue to sacrifice her soldiers, to send them to their deaths in a war that was no longer about humanity's future, but about its exploitation. With a heavy heart, Zoa made a decision that would change the course of the war and her own future. She ordered a retreat, not just from the battlefield, but from the galactic order that had manipulated her people. Zoa knew the consequences of her decision. It would mean abandoning humanity's alliances, severing ties with the galactic powers that had once promised recognition and equality. The human factions would be outraged, but Zoa was no longer willing to play their game. The cost of war had become too high, and humanity's future needed to be rebuilt, not through bloodshed, but through the preservation of its true essence. Her soldiers, though devastated by the decision, followed her lead. They understood the gravity of her choice. The war was no longer theirs to fight, not if it meant sacrificing what they were as humans. Zoa's command had always been built on the belief that humanity was worthy of its place in the galaxy. But now she saw that it wasn't about proving their worth. It was about preserving what made them human in the first place. As the retreat began, Zoa looked out over the battlefield, at the ruins of what had once been her battalion. The victory she had long sought was slipping further away. But in that moment, Zoa realized something profound. Humanity was not meant to fit into the galactic order. Perhaps they were never meant to conform to anyone's expectations. Maybe their true power lay not in their place among the stars, but in their ability to chart their own course. And if that meant walking away from the war, from everything they had fought for, then so be it. The future would be theirs to create, but only if they were brave enough to choose it. Zoa's decision to retreat from the war rippled through the galaxy with an intensity that no one, not even she, could have anticipated. The Tevra, who had once seen humanity as an inferior species to be manipulated, now watched with wary eyes. Humanity had become something different, something unexpected. They were no longer just soldiers fighting for survival. They were a symbol, a living testament to something the galaxy's established civilizations could not fully comprehend. a force that rejected the clean, orderly, controlled existence that the other species had spent millennia perfecting. Humanity's reputation spread, slowly at first, then like wildfire. No longer seen as mere pawns in a galactic game, humans began to embody something that frightened and fascinated the galaxy's more powerful factions: unpredictability. For a species that had long struggled to gain acceptance, the tide was shifting. The galaxy was beginning to realize that perhaps humanity's greatest strength was not their weaponry or their technology, but their inability to conform, their refusal to be tamed. Where others saw weakness in emotion and chaos, humans saw potential, the freedom to adapt, to create, to change. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Many species, including the Tevra, found themselves at a crossroads. Some tried to capture the essence of what made humans so unpredictable, hoping to harness it for themselves. They sought to study humanity's raw emotional force, to replicate it in a controlled environment. But how could you bottle chaos? How could you measure something as wild and untamable as human emotion? Despite their best efforts, the galaxy's most advanced minds could not understand the intricate beauty of human spontaneity. Some began to question whether such chaotic brilliance was worth the risk. Humanity was dangerous. After all, a species that could not be predicted, whose actions were driven by feelings, not logic. On the other side, other civilizations, particularly the ones who had seen humanity as little more than a nuisance, began to view them with outright fear. They recognized that a species so unpredictable could very well become a threat to the carefully established balance of the galaxy. As much as they wanted to learn from humanity, they also feared what the future could hold if the human spirit was allowed to flourish unchecked. Could such a species be contained? Could it ever truly be integrated into a galaxy that prided itself on order and harmony? Zoa's name became synonymous with the revolution, not through a violent uprising, but through a quiet act of defiance. She had not led her soldiers to a traditional victory, but to a future where humanity's place in the galaxy could be self-determined. Her actions, although not without cost, had sparked a movement that transcended military might. Zoa had chosen to leave the war, yes, but she had also chosen to preserve something more important: humanity's soul. And that, more than any weapon or battle won, was the true victory. As the years passed, the galaxy watched with a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and anxiety as humanity began to carve out its own path. Some species, like the Aether, who had long abandoned their emotional connections, began to slowly reintegrate elements of emotion and unpredictability into their culture. They sought to understand what made humanity tick, to explore the vast potential hidden in the very flaws that other species had discarded. In their attempts to learn, they found themselves questioning their own perfection. Was the pursuit of absolute order truly the best way to evolve? Could there be room for unpredictability in the galactic peace? But there were those who saw humanity as a threat, a force too powerful and uncontrollable to be allowed to thrive. The Zorath, for instance, had long relied on their calculating minds and strict adherence to logic. They viewed humanity's chaotic nature as a disease that could spread and destroy the fragile balance they had worked so hard to build. For the Zorath, the answer was clear: humanity's presence in the galaxy could not be tolerated, not if the stability of the entire galactic order was to remain intact. Meanwhile, Zoa, having returned to Earth, faced the aftermath of her decision in her own way. She had no illusions that the war was over, or that humanity had truly found its place among the stars. Earth was still vulnerable, the political factions within the human race still at odds, and the Tevra were far from defeated. But there was a sense of peace on Earth now, a sense that humanity was finally free to choose its future, without being pulled into the endless cycles of galactic warfare. Zoa's heart, however, was heavy with doubt. Could humanity truly live up to the legacy she had set in motion? Could they maintain their independence, their chaotic brilliance, or would they fall prey to the same systems that had almost destroyed them? Zoa understood the immense responsibility humanity now carried. They could no longer afford to let themselves be defined by others. But what if the galaxy couldn't accept them as they were? What if their very existence posed too much of a threat to those who had spent centuries perfecting order and control? Would humanity's rebellious nature be enough to secure their place in the galaxy, or would it ultimately lead to their destruction? The future, like humanity itself, remained unpredictable. As time passed, whispers began to circulate among the stars. Was humanity truly the most unpredictable species in the galaxy? Or was the true wild card something else entirely, something far older, far more dangerous, and far more powerful than anyone had yet imagined? The galaxy, still trying to adapt to the presence of this strange new force, began to look inward. Maybe humanity's chaotic nature was not a threat at all. Maybe it was the beginning of something entirely new, something that could change the fabric of the universe. Zoa, gazing at the horizon from Earth, knew that the fight was far from over. The stakes were higher than ever, and the future remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: humanity's journey had just begun. And whatever came next, Zoa would be ready, just as humanity would always be ready to face whatever came their way. The galaxy, for all its grand designs, had underestimated them. And in that underestimation lay their greatest strength. The question, as always, remained: would the galaxy embrace humanity, or would it destroy them in an attempt to preserve its own vision of perfection? Only time would tell.